Welcome, hello, and welcome. This is the 2021 Sizzling Summer Series sponsored by the UNMC College of Public Health Office of Public Health Practice, and we are very thankful to have our partners on this series led by the strength of the Midwestern Public Health Training Center and our partners, Wichita State University and the College for Public Health and Social Justice at St. Louis University. My name is Katie Brandert. I am the manager for workforce development and leadership programs in the Office of Public Health Practice here in Nebraska. My colleagues and I in the office are the host for this series, so welcome. This summer series is focused on exploring what it will take to become an anti-racist public health workforce and public health system. Over the months of June, July, and August, we are hosting a 5-part series, and today you have joined us for session 3. We're right in the middle, where we'll be focusing on structural versus individual inequalities. Before I turn it over to our speaker, I have a few logistics for you. There are a lot of us on the call today, so we're going to ask that you keep yourself muted for the time. Could be a couple of opportunities to unmute, I think. And if you have any questions for our speaker as she's going along, I'll be monitoring the chat box. She'll be monitoring the chat box. So feel free to use that and communicate in that way. If you experience any technical difficulties during the call today, just send me a private chat. I'm Katie Brandert for support. We are recording today's webinar. That's a popular question. We are recording it and the slides will be available. They will be posted and the recording will be both following the call on the UNMC Office of Public Health Practices page and the Midwestern Public Health Training Center website as well. Last thing, but important, a link to the evaluation will follow this call. Evaluation data is used to inform the content for the next call in the series for quality improvement overall, and of course for reporting purposes to our funders. So thank you very much in advance for completing that evaluation. We appreciate it. So I'm excited to introduce our speaker for this session and get into why we're here on the call today. We're joined today by Dr. Julie Reid. She's from the University of Southern Mississippi, where she's an associate dean for undergraduate education and an associate professor of sociology. She's also affiliate faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies program and in the Center for Black Studies. Dr. Reid has a PhD in sociology. Her teaching and research interests focus on social inequities and the intersections of race, gender, social class, and nation, particularly in educational contexts. You can see why we asked her to join us here today. She's previously worked at the National Institutes of Health and also in the U.S. Peace Corps in Malawi. Julie, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you very much for having me. Today's talk is, as mentioned, part of the this summer series, but in particular, I'm going to be talking about structural versus individual inequities and basically what are those differences, and a lot about how when we think about inequality, we think about individual inequality. And I think especially for this group, though, of course, we know how important that bigger picture is. And so during this talk, some of the things that I'm going to go through are clarifying the definition that we're going to use for racism, but also what does that mean in terms of, how we think of what racist is, what non-racist is, and anti-racist, which is what we want to get to. And secondly, again, that importance on social structure and how that's different from inequities that might be based on individuals. The importance of intersectionality as it relates to all of these issues, and the importance also of the legacy of racism, the historical context in which this happens, and then finally thinking about social change, which can either be transformative or transactional. So I'd like to start with a little thinking exercise. And the issue I'd like you to just think about, a hypothetical, is thinking about problems and their causes. So I have this nondescript figure here. All I'm going to tell you about him is that his name is John. And also, unfortunately, this imaginary figure, it turns out he has cancer, lung cancer. And so when we think, why did this happen to John? What might be some of the things that immediately pop up? Okay. Whoop. I'm just going to assume someone said smoking. I'm sorry.
Yes, I got you. So we've got smoking, or smog, farmer,
Okay.
radon, secondary smoke
Oh,
exposure.
right. Well, this comes to turn back as my slide jumped away from me, but he is a smoker, and this is his wife. And it turns out she also has developed cancer as well. And so if I ask, well, what's going on with his wife? You might have some thoughts as well. And perhaps, well, we already know John's a smoker, secondhand smoke. Maybe she's a smoker. Feel free to Katie to jump in. Sorry.
Yeah, we've got exposure to asbestos.
Ooh.
And other occupational hazards. And somebody put environmental racism in the chat box as well.
Well, I can tell I've got public health professionals in this audience, very much, yes. So a lot of things that might be causing it. And I could say, you know what? In fact, she's a smoker too. And maybe at that point you're like, well, commonly, people start to think, well, we know so well about the dangers of smoking. These things happen. But as you are well aware, there's often other things at hand. And so we step back and maybe look at the entire neighborhood, the entire city, and we realize this city has a rate of cancer, maybe that's 10 times what the norm is. And at that point, nobody's saying, oh, are they smokers? Do they have secondhand smoke? We just know, we assume something else is going on. We know it's bigger than the individual because you wouldn't see that kind of a pattern. And in fact, maybe we find out that a chemical factory did open up. So, close to them, it's been in operation for a couple of decades. And so we start seeing that what is happening to individuals is obviously related to their environment, which of course you were so ahead of in this. And of course, not just hypothetically, but in real life, we see this happening. One of the big examples that has been in the news a lot about this environmental injustice is the impact of spatial inequality. And in this particular case in Flint, we see that intersection not only of minorities in terms of social class, but also race, and that those are very connected. And so we can't really think about one without that other in terms of intersectionality. And of course, it's not just Flint. We see that it's a national problem. And so we have headlines all over. This has been going on for a long, long time. The segregated racial, social class nature of where dump sites are, or where toxic waste is. And in fact, it's gone worldwide. If we do a global analysis, we can see that when we run out of room in the higher income countries, we are shipping out our waste, particularly electronic waste. There are places all around the world where they basically take our harmful garbage. So we can see that inequality is not just national, but also global. So I like to conceptualize this relationship between society and the individual in a way, and I've come to put together this drawing to help illustrate that we have this society which is structured, it's macro level, it has to do with social institutions. And then we also have individuals, and individuals, they do have agency on the micro level. They have their interpersonal human behavior. And so we have, you see the arrow to your right, swerving down to your right, that's how structure shapes individuals in their experiences, and it happens in a very systematic way. So we have these common influences on individuals, which often makes them behave in very similar ways. You can even say conformity. But because they are individuals, some of them are going to resist, some of them are going to do something differently, some of them are going to push up against the grain. If they can get enough friends and people in their community on board, you can get kind of a mass where this collective action can work to change that norm and feed back into that system. So on that left-hand arrow, you see that the way people behave as individuals can either keep maintaining the system as it is through conformity or passivity, or it can also act to change it. And so I want to keep that sort of positive idea in mind. And no one's here saying, oh, the structure is so, we're just all puppets with no ability to do anything in that under that force of society. So at this point, I want to talk a little more also about intersecting identities. But if there are any questions, please jump in. Okay. So in terms of identities, most commonly we can think about the big eight, which are race, ethnicity, which refers to culture, gender, sexual orientation, social class, religion, age, and ability. But in particularly, I'd like to focus on these two, race and social class. They are they're all interrelated, but these two in particular. And I think often we think about race and social class as very separate items. And I think in the United States, we have a concern not to talk about social class. It's often considered not polite. It is often just taken for granted in a way. I've seen many you might call it intersectionality wheels, talking about these various identities, and they will list everything but social class. And so I invite you, anytime you see sort of a list of different types of identities that might be the subject of discrimination or differential power, that you make sure that it does include social class. And the fact that it's missing, I think that says something as well. So those two in particular, I'm going to be focusing a lot during this talk. And if we look at it more comprehensively, we can see that all of these identities and many, many more affect people's life chances depending where we can represent visually on the wheel they find. So this top half, which is sort of shaded blue, are those areas, the end of the spectrum where your identity falls in line with what society considers to be the norm and makes up the expectation for how we are often wanted to be, what we look up to as the model, as the way to be. And those whose identities fall on the other end of the spectrum, in that yellow shaded area, are often people who don't have the same kinds of advantages, who might be looked down on, who might have, for sure, different accesses in terms of their life chances. And the important thing is to remember is, rarely are people completely in the top sphere or the bottom half of the sphere. And we can have many, many different identities that put us along anywhere on the continuum based on these different identities. And so each one of us has a very different intersection, and we have to take those all into account in any time we're looking at inequities. So the processes that are related to these different types. They're very similar and they're intersectional, whether we're talking about racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, other types of ism. So even though I'm going to be focusing a lot on just a couple of them, you can keep those others in mind. Those are still active. They're not necessarily less important. They're out there. So I'm going to start with what is racism. So racism is based on what we can say, what we call race, which is important to realize that it is something that's socially constructed as being relevant. So, we can say, how is it that throughout time we have recognized different races or categorized people differently? And that's because it's based on culture, it's based on the society, it's based on rules and laws and policies that have been created in terms of how we count them, what characteristics are considered relevant in terms of separating the race, whether it's skin color or eye shape, or can be even one's religion. Many, many different characteristics can become racialized. And racism, though, most importantly, is a structural inequity, not just individual levels. And so when it's socially constructed as a hierarchy in which certain groups are systematically and relatively either advantaged or disadvantaged. So it's not about like one group is high, one group is low, but it's all in comparison relative to other groups. And when it's also structural, it defines what we consider normal or ordinary in our society, because we are all being influenced by it. We're surrounded by it. And the other aspect is that these constructs, these hierarchies, are formed historically over time. And in the case of racism and some others as well, they are passed on through the generations, whether it be advantage or disadvantage. And so, as I mentioned, it's systemic, not random. And as an example of this, we can think, if Monday Alfred was treated badly or suffered some harm based on the fact he was white, but on Tuesday, Bernard was treated badly or experienced some harm for being Black, we can say that's random. One day it's one person, another day it's another person. And, we often hear the expression, well, Black people can be racist too, Asian people can be racist too. And of course, those things happen individually. It can go in any direction. But when we think about, okay, what happens on Wednesday, on Thursday, on Friday, what happens next week, what happens next month, and what is the pattern we see? We do see it isn't random. It is not always going back and forth. There is a particular trend in terms of which groups are experiencing harm. And the reason is, of course, that it is coming out of that structure. If it were just individuals, we would see it randomly going in all directions. And so it's important to think about that cumulative effect of systemic inequality. And here we can see a course dramatic example in terms of what has been happening over, this is a chart of the last 40 years in terms of life expectancy. And as many of us have heard recently, it's been dropping for the first time in memory just recently. And of course, with COVID-19, we see this a much more dramatic drop off. But what we also see in this pattern is, even though overall it's been going up higher, that there is this, slightly decreasing, but pretty substantial and consistent gap between, for example, the white population and the Black population. And that's how we can see it's historical and very much a pattern. We don't see, 1 year, 2000, and somehow the lines are crisscrossing. No, it even with the COVID and the drop, the gap remains consistent. And this is some more recent data, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. But I think it just puts it into sort of stark numbers, the kinds of differences we're seeing based on groups. And again, those systemic differences, not random, but those pattern ones that are a sign of what the structure looks like. And so we're seeing up to 2.4 times the death rate in certain populations, American Indians specifically, or double. And even among Asians who have basically a comparable or same rate in terms of hospitalization death, but they also have fewer cases. So that sort of skews it. So even with smaller cases, yet when it comes to hospitalization and death, it's they're at the same rate as whites. So when we look at this, that leads us to this topic of what is often called structural violence. And so structural violence is a form of violence which is based on social structures in institutions being a cause of the harm on people when they are not able to meet their basic needs due to the way society is created. And some of the other facts are that if we think about this kind of harm being done to people, including death, it is the deadliest form of violence through excess death. And that are those deaths that wouldn't have occurred in a more equal society. And so those differences in death rates, those excess deaths, are based on inequalities of race, class, gender, and they're manifested in many different types of disparities, not just health and economics, and of course they're all related. They're also very much related to direct forms of violence that we might traditionally think of, whether domestic violence, suicides, homicides, wars, and such. But yet this structural violence, which is responsible for so many deaths, the most deaths as a result of violence, are typically overlooked because we're thinking of, oh, it's structure, it's not individual, right? We hear about mass murders. We don't hear about the thousands of people, except maybe in your profession, who are dying from excess death. And so by thinking about structural violence, though, we can think about what should be the norm. How can we think about what a peaceful society is that does not have such violence, rather than just thinking about reducing violence in itself? So what does it mean to be non-racist and anti-racist? So let's first start with the racist. This is my character I've created. Don't want anybody to, take it individually, but here is, I think, the stereotype of the racist. And they're saying, I'm not a racist, but, because always watch out when someone says, I'm not a racist, but I don't like those people in that other group. I'm better than them. And, of course, they're evil and they're bad, right? Or nowadays, you can't say those out loud. So maybe they're just thinking it, same thing. I don't like them. I'm better than them, but just not saying it out loud. Then we have what we may call the non-racist. This is someone who thinks and says, I think everyone's equal. I'm definitely not a racist. I think that's wrong. I'm colorblind. I see everyone equally. Again, not a racist or non-racist, supposedly. Now let's think about an anti-racism. And anti-racism, what's important is to understand it's not about I. It's about society. It's about structure. So racism is about a system of inequality. And the anti-racist says, well, how am I a part of that system? How do I interact with that system? How can I combat racism? What's my role in terms of both society and myself? Katie, if you can help by jumping on with any comments or questions.
Yes,
please
there
do.
Actually there is a question in here. Someone asked, can you talk more about institutions that prevent meeting basic needs?
Yes, very big. And I am talking about them generally because it is so big. I'm going to try to hold on to that a little to a little later, if you don't mind. And then if I seem to be skipping over it, please jump back in and say, hey, Is this Mary you meant to talk about it? So I ask if we can hold on to it for a little bit.
That sounds good. And I think other than that, people are just commenting on some of the powerful images in your slides.
Okay. Or even cute, I've heard. So the question of this, I think many of you might be familiar with this book. It was a New York Times bestseller by Robin DiAngelo, who is a white woman, and she wrote this book. She just came out with her new book, but this one was called White Fragility. And in it, she really talks about, these labels and the problem that racism has been simplified and misconstrued to the point where people think it's about individuals doing it, that it's done consciously and it's done intentionally. And if this is someone's understanding of what racism is, about individuals purposely being, bad to one another, if someone accuses you of being a racist, well, you must be a bad person. And if someone's accusing you of being a bad person, you automatically feel like you have to defend yourself. But if we understand that discrimination is structural, and so it's not just about individuals, and it can happen without a clear perpetrator and a clear victim. It's much bigger and broader than that. And then we can understand racism isn't something that I need to just feel personally responsible and guilty about, but understand I am a part of a system that produces it. And so what's my role? And I really like this article that had appeared in Color Lines, and it talks about racial transformers. And of course, later, we're going to, talk about what's the difference between transformative and transactional change. And in this article, it's like it came out on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It's often it's been very popular, so they kind of re-release it occasionally. But the title of the article was How to Be a Racial Justice Hero on MLK Day and All Year Long. And I think it really captures this idea of this difference and the idea of being an anti-racist versus a non-racist. And just highlighting a part, I'm going to read from it. It notes that racial transformers don't fixate on who's a racist or whether someone intends animus. For they know that the deepest racism lies not just in the hearts and minds of individuals, but in the roles and rules of big institutions like schools, courtrooms, and corporations. And I'll add medical institutions to that. That's their primary focus, right? These familiar systems that are bringing about daily these deep and deadly racial inequalities. Sorry, I had to paraphrase, my screen's covered, but I think you can see there. And I want us to keep that in mind about trying to separate us individually from this larger problem, that is beyond us, but that we're a part of and we can help impact as well. So what are some examples of what this systemic inequity might look like? And how is this different from individual bias and prejudice? I have another example at this point, and I'll need some help. Does anybody recognize this scene?
Yes.
And
absolutely.
Yes. And you want to share just a brief description of what happened here, what was going on?
Are you talking to me, Julie?
Sure. Anybody who recognizes the scene.
Super. This woman was out walking her dog. This black man was out walking his dog. She did something that he commented on. She immediately went off on him, calling 911 and lying to 911 that this man was harassing her. She was choking the dog out on the chain. Oh, she didn't have her dog on the leash. He was filming her lying to 911 about him attacking her.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I had to say.
Yes. Well, that pretty much sums it up. What happened. Her name was Amy Cooper. The gentleman's name was Christian Cooper, no relationship. So we have Amy and Christian, and yes, he asked if she could leash her dog. And apparently she got very upset at that, said she was being harassed, but also she threatened him as she was about to call, saying, I'm going to call and say, you're attacking me. And of course, she did exactly that. It was all caught on video. And coincidentally, this actually happened the exact same day that George Floyd was killed. And so you have this context also, both at the moment, which of course the true information hadn't yet come out about, or the whole story hadn't circulated widely about George Floyd. But when they happened just about at the same time and the news was coming out, there were many ways to see sort of these parallels. And so what we saw during this sort of incident, it's two individuals who ran into each other, one who acted in a way that was very discriminatory, but it played on these other types of intersectional identities. The fact that Christian was a man, not just a Black person, but a Black male. The fact that she was not just a white woman, a white person, but a white woman. And so you have these intersections of gender and race. And so she had to, the fear of that, like she knew if she said, not a person is attacking me, but a man is attacking me, not just a man, but a Black man is attacking me, it would elicit a different kind of reaction. And that is because the history of how those identities have been constructed, what baggage comes with it, the historical fear of, the threat of supposedly of Black men against white women. And so she, in her phone call, basically called upon all those historical types of discrimination. And so many people recognize this, but what I didn't hear much talked about was what happened after the incident. Of course, people were appalled, justifiably. They thought it was terrible. And they said, he is an upstanding person. He's educated. He's a bird watcher. What's more benign than that? And so really, they defended him on levels of his class, his social class. He didn't deserve this, He is a righteous middle-class person. And so he was able to supposedly overcome what she did to him on that basis. But to me, those arguments imply, what if he was a poor guy? What if he was jobless? What if he was homeless? Does that mean that what she did was okay? And so again, that class component we don't think about. And it's really important to think not just about the current societal context, but also the historical one. So I just thought this is a kind of an example for seeing how those come together. So how is the past relevant today? And at this time, I'd like us all to just imagine, completely aside from your race, think about how has your income or wealth level been affected by your parents' level? So imagine if your parents were very rich or very poor, how would that have affected your chances to be either rich or poor or just middle class yourself? And how maybe things they taught you, money they gave you, what cultural values they educated you, the school you went to, whether college was an expectation or not, what neighborhood you grew up in, all of those things. So with those in mind, and we think about like how our parents' economic situation might affect our economic chances. And even in terms of when you were born, how might the money that your parents earned 10 years before your birth actually affect your circumstances 40 years later when you're an adult? Anybody? All right. I'm going to assume you're thinking about it. So we're going to look at exactly what that may look like. And you might think about, well, they made some money before I was born, but that enabled them to make a little nest egg by which I could have my college education paid. And of course, once you get a college education, that sets your career in motion. That sets what you're doing in retirement. So somehow, what your parents earned before you were even born is affecting your life when you retire. How much inheritance you leave to your children. We're already now looking at 3 generations of people in terms of how they're impacted by their social class. And we often think about like United States, oh, it's the American dream. And of course, many people change their social class. Many people, you're not beholden, but we do see clear patterns. And that is, the society is not working with you to change your social class. That's where a lot of other factors come in. Now, this is an example using some data from previous years, which examines the parents' household rank. Again, we're just looking at class, and the outflow in terms of where their children end up in terms of their household rank when the children are adults. And just to make it clear, I've highlighted some of the numbers. And you can see that column diagonal right down the middle from top left to bottom right. It's really clear. You don't even need a graph to see it, that the most common place that children end up as adults, not when they're kids and they're growing up with their parents, as adults, is the same layer, the same strata that their parents were in, right? And what you see across here, so I don't have a pointer, yes, if you look and parents who are in the bottom fifth of income, there's 8% of their kids end up in the top fifth, but 45% end up in the bottom. Same with the opposite direction. Parents are filthy rich, but yet, 55% end up in the same group, but 5% do end up in the bottom group. Things happen, it's not absolutely predictable. But in the long run, what we see from all of this data is it's pretty even. Most stay stable, and about the same number go up as go down, slightly more up than down. And we can look at this data across countries and recognize that social mobility in the United States is definitely not the highest among high income countries. So we notice that difference, and we know that has to do with the structure of society, not individuals. And so here's another figure, again, separate from race, looking at intergenerational social mobility. So this was from an article that the New York Times had a while ago, really digging into social class and social class mobility. And what they represent here is sort of a typical progression of a poor American family and how long it would take a very, very poor family based on how things tend to ordinarily go and the statistics that we know on social class mobility, how long it would take them to get to average income. So that line at the top is not like high income, it's average. So all of these represent people in generations that have below average. That first line marker there is representing 20% of average income. So typically we would see that just to go from extremely poor, 20% of average income, to almost average income might take 4 generations. That would be a normal progress in our society. And so I added these years that on the bottom that might represent what 4 generations look like, maybe going from 1950 to 2020, bringing us to where we are. Now let's think about that in terms of not only social class, but put race on top of it, and why looking at that historical timeline is so important in understanding race. It's not about, we've all heard, well, there's not any slavery now. Why are people talking about it? We had the civil rights movement. So often when I talk about, what racism looks like in 2020, they're like, oh, that doesn't exist now. Of course, they don't understand the structure, but even granted, even if that were true, if I say, well, what about 1950? They're like, oh, no, in 1950, it was terrible. But luckily, we're not living in those times anymore. 1950, that was pre-civil rights. There were segregated public facilities. You couldn't even go to the same school together, etc. And so if, though, that kind of discrimination existed in 1950, we see it's not suddenly like civil rights were passed. No, it lives generation after, the impact of it is living generation after generation. And so, we can take this back 4, 5, 6 generations. And, sometimes it might go up, sometimes it might go down, the difference that's made. but it makes a difference. And so this is where we start to see why that legacy of racism, that historical racism, is so important to understanding the current structure and how that is completely intersectional and interlinked with the normal dynamics of social class in our society. So let's look a little more at these processes of social inequality and how they work. And again, this can apply to many different types of generation. So I think it's very important then to look at these cumulative impacts again. So in this figure, I show this past discrimination. Looks like my pluses and minuses gotten a little off kilter. So past discrimination, we may think of, poor access to healthcare, inferior schooling, the encumbrance of having to caretake for others who are not taken care of by the social system, maybe difficulty getting a job, lack of inherited wealth from people who had difficulty getting a job, et cetera. And we're like, okay, that happened in the past. And then we look at what's happening today. There's still discrimination going on. There's can be bias going on in hiring, ability to get insurance based on jobs, biases in lending, housing. Housing is the number one way that people build wealth, being able to buy housing, buy houses. But yet we see that there are continuing inequalities in being able to get loans, health inequities, political inequities. And so in order to understand what's happening today, we have to take all of those into account: past discrimination, current discrimination, for what I call this cumulative impact of discrimination. And so, even if there was just discrimination today or not today and only in the past, it would have an impact cumulatively. And so, we can take it to the next level and think about how connected that past policy, those past policies of discrimination were. And yet think about how little we look at them, even though they're having their impact. And I use this example of completely unreal, hopefully, in the actual practice. If you fill out a job application, and instead of saying those normal questions that you see, what was your family's household income when you were born? You're gonna be like, this is outrageous. What has this to do with anything? Did your mother go to college? Did your grandfather own real property? What race were your grandparents? You'd say, this has nothing to do with my qualifications. Chances are all of those factors greatly influenced the chances of what kind of, quote, qualifications and situation you are in now. Not directly, indirectly, but we just saw those figures on how big an influence is that intergenerational movement is of social class, which is also then connected to race. And I threw this picture in because, it's like post-World War II picture of college students. And it's also talking about the GI Bill and all the people that this allowed to, go to school, get housing. But, the untold story is how many Black people came back from World War II and didn't have those same kinds of access to those things that opened up a whole generation of middle class people. And I also noticed there's like 2 women in the class. So very different. So we think these normal operations of society. And so earlier, that question of what are some of these institutions involved in these systemic types of discrimination? These are just some of them. These are small, we could write a book on each one of these. But if we think in terms of education, the fact that we use standardized exam scores, whether SAT or GRE, and we know for a fact that those are directly correlated with social class and that they can be improved through training and repeated exam taking. And of course, not only is it knowing and preparing, but those tests cost money, right? And then some colleges only require that you send the highest score. Well, who does that advantage in terms of test preparation? People who can take it multiple times. People know that maybe you should. People who go to private schools and have literally 4 years in high school of test preparation, like literally a class dedicated to test preparation because they know it's so important. Income, the fact that we higher levels of higher level jobs select applicants who have more degrees, more years of professional experience. And of course, we're like, well, how else would we do it? I'm not suggesting we do it another way, but you realize the normal way we do it also reflects previous historical inequalities. Wealth, housing loans favor people who already have money, who already make down payment. You want to have the collateral. And we were like, well, that's just normal. Yes, yes, it is. And so that inability, when you don't have the wealth to make more wealth, that has severe implications for, where you live, the kind of housing you have, whether you can build wealth, whether you're living in those areas that are going to have those spatial inequalities in terms of environmental hazards, how close to healthcare facilities that they might be, etc. Rural, urban differences. Healthcare. Healthcare insurance usually has a deductible and it's provided through full-time employment. What if you can only find hourly employment or it doesn't come with healthcare, right? Or part-time employment. So all of those issues that how we have a system, and of course, this has been a topic of national conversation exactly for this reason. And political rights. The fact that we have felony disenfranchisement where, that can bar you from voting for the rest of your life. So, if a person has, and some people say, oh, they're criminals, they should never be able to vote again. Well, if they have served their time and they come out, should they really have no voice in a society that they are part of? But these are all, quote, normal operations of society. And so we start to see it's not an easy thing to go like, well, we'll just get rid of everything. We're surrounded by it. We're living in it. Any questions, comments at this point? So I like to use this analogy as well in thinking about the sort of magnitude of the issue. And I call it the unfair game. So imagine a basketball game where halfway through, it's discovered that the team that's in the lead has been playing unfairly with 2 extra players on the court. Now, don't ask me how nobody noticed there were 2 extra players on the court, but let's just give it that. And with these 2 extra players, they've been making many more baskets, better passes. So they are definitely way in the lead. And suddenly at halftime, they're like, whoa, we just discovered this has been completely unfair. And the team that is ahead goes, you are right. This is a wrong. We had 2 extra players. We got all these points, extra points. Okay, you know what? We're getting rid of those 2 players. Let's just continue the game, keep the points where they are, and we will play fairly from the halftime to the end of the game. Who's likely to win? Who's likely to be ahead? Can that team that was losing ever catch up? We're like, when I presented with this question, people are like, well, you'd probably just call the whole game off. You'd have to start over. You can't just keep those points. But in society, that's exactly what we're doing. We're saying, well, we're equal now, so we don't have to consider anything that happened in the past. And so part of looking at that big structure is thinking how it works. And this is my own doodling, someone climbing up the hill. And it doesn't mean that those people didn't work. And that first half of that game, it's not saying that those team players didn't play very hard. And so here's someone climbing up this mountain. He's like, this has really been hard, but I'm almost at the top. He's proud of his achievements. And, I couldn't do that. He's doing very well. And then here's another person coming from much farther ahead. They're also saying, this is really hard. It's so much to the top. But the first one saying, oh yeah, if you just keep climbing, if you work as hard as me, you can make it too. And we've always heard, those success stories that say, I made it, you can too. But often those things don't consider those larger contexts. And it's not to say that it couldn't happen. We saw on that table how there are those differences. There are people who completely end up in different categories of wealth and socioeconomic status than previous generations of theirs. But we also see the structure at play and the trends and the fact of, the person on the right can definitely get to the top, but they'll probably just have to work harder. And that is a fact. And so it can't be ignored. Another important part about recognizing how certain groups have been advantaged and others have been disadvantaged relative to each other, what we might call privilege and disadvantage, because it's relative. It's not only that in the past someone got ahead, but understanding how does that apply today. So I have this fictional example of 10 applicants who are trying to get a job or trying to get housing or a loan. It could be any number of things. And there's 10 of them, and they're, let's say, in competition with each other. And the different colors represent different types of people, different groups of people, maybe different races of people. Now, due to someone else's discrimination, let's say you're one of these job applicants, due to someone else's discrimination, the boss, that you don't even know about, you don't know how they're picking the employees, they decide to write off, we don't want these kinds of people. They're not the right people. So suddenly, now instead of 10 people competing for the job, there's just 7. If you would belong to these group that's still left in the 7, has your advantage, your chance of getting that job just increased? Because you're 1 out of 7 instead of 1 out of 10. And so this is where the fact of that some people are disadvantaged and some people are privileged as a group, even when you had nothing to do with it yourself, you didn't even know about it, we are still affected by it. And it can be in negative ways and it can be in positive ways. And so in talking about privilege, which I know that the next session is going to be about. So, I don't want to get too much into it, but just thinking that it has to do with relativism. And it's not about saying that someone didn't work hard because, it's just relative to others. It's not saying that they don't deserve to be where they are. It's not about whether one feels it or not. I don't feel privileged because you wouldn't know how you feel, because you have to understand what's relative to everyone else. And certainly it's also not something to feel guilty about. You had nothing necessarily to do with it at all. And so, guilt is not what we want to feel just because you got something that you didn't, but to think about, well, what can I do with it? I have privilege, I didn't ask for it, but how do I use it now? And this idea of being colorblind doesn't just make us invisible, race invisible, but it makes the racism that goes along with races invisible. And whether that is the oppression side of it or the privilege side of it. Before we go on to the next section, any comments?
Hi. So what I'm hearing is that class is really the most, that's the huge thing. It results to a lower status, lower privilege, lower, just more inequities. And we talk about gender orientation, we talk about gender, we talk about race, and there's so much focus on that. And I don't know that I would know how to address class aside from in public health, we do health policy, universal health insurance, those kinds of things. But as an individual, I probably make discriminatory thoughts when I'm in a certain neighborhood, or, I might be more cautious if there are homeless people. I mean, all these things that I do that I don't even think about and I don't deal with. So I guess I'm wondering, are you going to talk about how important is class an issue? I mean, it's just, we talk a lot about race, and I think
Yes, I very much appreciate that. And I think, the fact that we don't talk about social class, I would say that in itself is a social problem and a structural one. With my research, I lived in lots of different places, and it's been sort of amazing to me how in other cultures it is much more talked about. It is an inequality that they appreciate, just like racial inequality, and they see them very much as linked. And I think anyone who's trying to understand racial inequality, you can't do that without also understanding social class inequality. And, this is the issue where, like, people say, I'm and it's hard to really explore. I'm actually this coming fall going to teach an entire semester long class on social class, and I feel like it's not enough time. But we can start to think about why do we take it for granted? And it's not even in the realm of the impossible. We can even look to other countries and think that have higher social mobility than us and say, well, what are some of the things about how their society is set up that's different than how our society is set up? How can that be a more fair exercise? I think about when I look at job applications and, do I just look for the person with the highest degree who has the most publications? Do I look at what their backstory is to understand, what went into that? When you look at their cover letter, does it fit the stereotypical format? I mean, how much are we often looking for signs of cultural capital when we look at CVs and resumes, and not just actual ability? And I think, that's just maybe a start on a personal level, on a professional level. But yes, very, very important. And I think in order, for the sake of understanding structural racism, I really think that we need to make social class a more important conversation, because they are absolutely linked.
So I go to a school that is really Catholic, and I'm not gonna lie, very much like, I think they're all white people in my class, I'm not gonna lie. And so when I try and bring up different examples, like for example, my sister teaches in a very rough neighborhood in Sioux Falls at a school called Whittier, and she's in the tier 2 room, which is like teaching social skills to kids who are about to go to jail for different reasons. And those children come from families who like one parent's in jail and the other one's not working, and those kids are just borderline age where they can't get a job because they're like 13, so they're not old enough, so they start running the streets. And so I'll bring those into examples into my class, and like I feel like people get offended that I talk about that, and I'm like, it's important to like talk about these things because we're in public health, and like these are issues that are happening. And I guess I don't know why I'm like bringing this up. It's just like people get offended, and I'm like, we're in public health, this is important. These are things that are happening in the world, and like these kids are stuck in like a social oppression, like like they're just stuck in a cycle, and they end up like their parents because like yeah, so they end up in jail like their parents because they're trying to take care of their family, and it's really sad. And I'm sorry, I don't know what their whole
Oh, no. I mean, and again, it goes to the fact of how related they are. I think a fantastic documentary looking at sort of those intersections, if you're talking about prison and social class and race, there's a doc, many of you have probably seen it, called 13th.
Yes.
And I mean, you start seeing how our criminal justice system, I mean, even talking, and then when we think about like, the fact that felons lose the right to vote, yet you see that a particular group of people, in terms of their gender, race and class are systemically, disproportionately made and put in those group of felons, end up as felons. You know, what does that say for our political democracy? It's, you know, some people are just not allowed to vote. They've lost the right to vote. We're talking about the Constitution of the United, we're talking about fundamental idea of democracy, you know, but yet we often don't. And, you know, and this is why I hope that like more people like you want to think about this and we engage in learning. I mean, and it took me like 30 years to get here, you know, so it's not a fast process. It's not easy. But what we want to do, you know, going back to, you know, not the non-racist, being the anti-racist, you know, like asking questions of ourselves, asking questions of our society and how we can change that. I really like where this is going, and maybe I wanted to go through a few more things in terms of sort of related to this idea of change and what we can do. And then hopefully have a little time for continued conversation and questions. And so, as I noted before, if we're thinking about, you know, moving towards like these solutions, where do we go from here? And so, you know, this thing called structure, you know, we can't see it directly, but we see it through the patterns we see among individuals. And so, you know, some of the things that people say, oh, you know, as I'm going to just mention, you know, oh, you shouldn't talk about that. That isn't right. You know, that's stereotypical. But sometimes we can look at the statistics and say there are actual patterns. And the patterns, when we see them as patterns, it's not about vilifying that particular individual or group, but it's about asking questions of our society. You know, what does the structure look like? Why is it creating these patterns of experiences and issues that we're seeing among actual individuals? And so institutional and systemic discrimination works in a particular direction. That's what we see when we see that kind of the top level, the structure. But when it's individual, we can see it random. It's going in every direction. But when it comes to race and social class, that is not what we see. And so, you know, going back to the issue of Flint, Michigan and the water issue, and I also like to think about this idea of looking at the structure versus these individual changes as, you know, are we just trying to treat the symptoms or are we working on curing the disease? And so, you know, in terms of the problem that the individuals are suffering in Flint, we can say like, oh, well, let's, you know, they have a very big infrastructure developed to distribute clean bottled water to these people who cannot drink their own water. And though it's a mechanism, they're trying to help the situation, improve the situation, but it needs to be done. But is that as far as we're going to get? Or we might say, well, this is an example of how we need a better healthcare system. Well, that would be huge in many, many ways and affecting many, many other things than this. But that's also, you know, in some ways, what does that health insurance include? If it's just about treating people after they get sick and have been poisoned by lead, you know, you're really not curing the disease. And so you can go through these like many, many layers, deeper, the lower level cause, more foundational cause, and start to think like, where does the problem lie? How can we start chipping away? But we can't just do it all at once. You know, although some may want to, and sometimes we do have a revolution, and we might have a revolution. I don't see it coming anytime quick, but we can think, how can we chip away to make dramatic change over time? I mean, if you think about where we are today versus 100 years ago, you know, we don't want to wait 100 years. We've made big change. And so, but we also need to think, most of us are not going to last 100 years. So those little changes are also important. Those changes that make significant difference for individuals are important as well. And I admit sociologists have a tendency to go like, those are just individual solutions. We need transformative change. Well, I'm going to be dead by the time any of these transformative changes happen. And I also believe in helping people now is very important. So that brings us to this topic of transformative versus transactional change. So transactional changes are types of reform or challenges, fixing challenges within the structure that exists to allow groups to achieve their goal. So it mostly works within that system. It makes things better. It makes them more functional. It makes significant changes. But transformative changes are those that are fundamental and actually restructuring how the system is. It's about rearrangement, beyond, I should say, beyond rearrangement of just, like what they say, moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. That would be, maybe something that's ineffective, we'd say. But these are the ultimate goal of where we really want to put our attention. How do we make those transformative changes? And they're both important. You can't, it's easily just say, a clean line between them. They're overlapping a lot, and we should work on both fronts. So I would really be interested in hearing from you and what some of your ideas are in terms of some of these solutions. These are just some starters, thinking about how to be an anti-racist in terms of how to address those inequalities. On a personal level, and these are things that maybe we can really help, just honestly self-reflecting and being perspective. The educating ourselves. Like I said, I've been at this for 30 years, and my thinking has changed so much over those 30 years. I was always against racism. That seemed an easy starting point, but understanding what that entails, what an anti-racist versus a non-racist is, understanding that structural component, in the intersectionality of it, that's all taken longer. And recognize and acknowledging your own privileges. Like I said, it's not something you need to feel bad about, except if you don't think it matters to other people, or you don't wish to do any good with your privilege. Often people with privilege are in a good position, better position than others, to help change that system. And often this requires stepping out of our comfort zone and what comes naturally to us. Part two, I call it taking individual and small group level steps. Teach through example. This is when we're interacting with others, talking to others about what we've learned, how we're feeling, monitoring ourselves just in our interaction. What are the kinds of things that we say, the language we may use without thinking about what it suggests or the implications of it. When we hear a joke that's racist or even classist, not just avoiding saying them, but, calling out people. You don't have to slam them, make them feel horrible, but, make them have a second thought about how that is harmful or why that you don't want to participate in it. And again, having conversations, not only conversations, but not only within our groups, but with other groups as well. We have to have that interaction. And as many of us know through social media, we have tended to become more segregated in many ways in terms of those we share ideas with, rather than less segregated, even though we're supposedly becoming a more diverse society. And then finally, as we move forward, thinking about how can we participate in that systemic change, both at the community level and at the society level. The first thing I would say is it's a political fight. And so you have to have your voice heard. The most obvious is voting, but you can also contact your political representatives, stay on top of new policies that are coming out. And I'll say there are so many apps and websites that make it so much easier now where you can actually track it, the apps that actually will form your message and send it directly to your congressperson. Join organizations and social movements focused on change. And this is where you can really share ideas and work on things. It might be first small things, local things, but they could also be national movements. And put your money where your values are. If you think, this is like, if an organization is bad, you don't have to try not to buy from them. What are alternative places you can buy from? Also, what kind of organizations and movements do you support? If you, and it doesn't have to be money, volunteer time, so it's a very, very long project, big project, lifetime project. I'm gonna skip over here. Some of you have probably seen this popular image. It's gone all over social media. It's supposed to represent the difference between equality versus equity. And you can see here equality, everyone treated exactly the same, versus equity, where we realize people are coming from different places and they might need different tools to be able to get to the same position. But more recently, there's been a new version of this, which I think makes us understand this idea of transformative change better. And this last panel talks about liberation, what we can truly call transformative change when those barriers and those boxes are no longer needed because society itself is changed. All right, those are some of my sources, which you can get in the full version. And thank you very much for listening. I wish I could have seen more of you during the talk,
Julie,
but
before you take your slides down, because we could take the slides down for a minute, but before you do that, someone requested a quick look at step 1 again, just a few slides back.
There we go.
And I think there was, so let's, I'm looking to make sure, I think it was a lot of commentary and kind of sharing back and forth going on in the chat. So I'm going to invite folks that if you have a question for Julie to use the reactions feature on your Zoom toolbar and choose the raise hand button. And then Julie and I will both be able to see that you have a question. We'll be able to call on you. We have about 10-ish minutes before the end of the call, so we can get a few questions in for sure, if there are some.
My comment is first of all, I put it in chat that the picture of the woman with the dog elicited a very visceral reaction in my body. And I was surprised by that. I don't want to, comment any further on that, but all that you've spoken of has been just a wonderful, great presentation. My hope is that people will begin to acknowledge, number one, acknowledge classism, because we here in America, that's all over the chat. We don't acknowledge that there is classism, because if we did that, then we'd have to acknowledge that there is racism and that there is racism and genderism and sexism and all of these isms. So we value, this is how we came over here. We came over for independence, and we're individuals, and we're pulling up by our bootstraps, and we don't acknowledge that other stuff. So I appreciate your presentation, and I'm going to be quiet because I'm a preacher, and I will keep going. So thank you so much, Julie. I love the presentation.
Thank you so much.
Are there questions or comments? There's some great comments in the chat.
I just wanted to make one comment. I appreciate the relationship and the very strong relationship between classism and racism, but I'm also sensitive to the fact that I'm starting to hear people say that there really isn't racism, it's all classism, and I think that that's false. And I just wondered what your response is to that, Julie.
Yes, I mean, and certainly that is a vein of thought. Like any of you study Marxist theory, a sociologist, and The thing is, what we also have to recognize is that there are groups of people who we have this classist system, and then groups of people are forced to occupy certain rungs on that class system. And so, typically I find myself always encouraging that importance of social class anymore. And I think also the way social class works, it encourages racism in the fact that everyone is just trying to get ahead. And sometimes whenever you feel like it's so hard to get to the top and there's this feeling of fear, I'm shocked by surveys, national surveys, who ask, which groups are being discriminated against. And the majority of people think the tide has turned, where it used to be against Black people, but now it's against white people. And, I also ask, in terms of the, percentage of people, even if everybody, all groups were, quote, equally racist, the fact that only 15% of the population is Black, like 5% is Asian. I live in Mississippi. I ask my students, what percent of the population nationally do you think are Black? And they're like, 75%. I'm like, not even in Mississippi, and we have often these very distorted ways of sort of understanding it based on our own surroundings, the people we hang out with. And so I think understanding what those numbers are, and I'm thinking like, if some people, some groups were, are thinking, I'm not Black and 75% of them are, and they're angry and they're protesting in the streets, maybe they should be scared, because there has been damage done, terrible damage. But part of it is just being factually aware. And so at this point, I just, even thinking about what our class system in the United States was built on, I don't think that those can be removed. But again, I don't think racism can ever be even sufficiently addressed without completely incorporating this question of class.
Thank you. And we have enough time for one more question.
So I've got some colleagues who work with school-based mental health services, and so there's been a lot of pushback in communities across Indiana recently related to social emotional learning, and they're connecting there are groups that are facilitating. They have websites and things where they'll put videos online about maybe LGBTQ plus videos or what, and then they put this like ominous music to the background, and then they're relating this to critical race theory, and it's really quite ominous. And so we have different schools that are, as a result of everything that's happened in the past year with the protests and things, who are adopting uh, different like equity related sort of initiatives. And so then there's pushback within the schools, and they're relating all this to critical race theory. And so it makes it very difficult as I am doing education and facilitating discussions, because what ends up happening is that if you talk about the things that you're talking about in your presentation, which I do, I talk about privilege and intersectionality, etc., then there's this movement to just dismiss all of these things as like left wing ideology and whatnot. And so I'm saying all of this to say, or to ask, how do you frame the discussion in a way that you can still get through to people that you're not coming from a biased position with what you're talking about? And then, are there any trends that are happening in the anti-racist movement to address some of these kinds of things? I know that's a really deep question. So
I'm afraid I couldn't hear a little parts of it. I tried to turn up the volume, so I might not fully address your question, and you can jump in as that. Yes, that is a very big question, and I don't have the answers, and I opened it up to the group here. I think one of the reasons I appreciate it from a teaching point of view, this importance of intersectionality, aside from from a research point of view, I mean, the truth of it that you can see in statistics and patterns is that we can see how we all belong somewhere on that wheel. And, we can think about, you may be white, but if you're, belong to the lower class or underclass, working class, and what is society doing to you? I mean, how this, part of it is in these stereotypes about, I'm from Mississippi, like we hear, these uneducated, redneck whites, and not understanding intersectionally, we have to understand all the many, many forms of privilege and disadvantage that we have, and that nobody is one strand, one spoke in that intersectionality wheel. And I think when people can kind of come to it and start looking at it, that so much of this applies, like I said, we might be talking about racism or class, but it can apply to any other type of structural racism, structural inequality, and to realize that, hey, these same things, the critical race theory that helps me understand structural inequality in terms of race, that will also help you understand gender inequality, class inequality, heterosexism, religious inequalities. And I think our kind of singular focus where we don't think about intersectionality is hard. And, when I lecture, I will also admit, we always get so serious and somber. And of course, these are very serious and somber issues. But I also, when I'm teaching, like to make people laugh. I bring in the YouTube videos. I say, okay, this made us realize, this is funny because we realize a truth about it. Let's unpack that. And sometimes it's hard for people to be mad and laughing at the same time. And that's just my little pedagogy, but I think that intersectionality is really, really important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie, for leading us in this conversation today and sharing from your life experiences and life work, these fantastic concepts that clearly people are resonating with and wanting to bring forward with them. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for participating in the chat and offering questions and suggestions as well, and your own ideas and experiences. I've just placed in the chat box a link to register for session 4 of our 5-part series. Session 4 will focus more deeply on empathy, privilege, and cultural humility. We are so glad you were able to attend Sizzling Summer Series session number 3. So number 4 is July 29th, 1 p.m. Thank you again, Julie. And thank you everyone for completing the evaluation for the call, which will be sent sometime in the next day or so. So from all of us at the Midwestern Public Health Training Center, see you on July 29th, and take care.
Thank you all.